Howdy everyone, it has been a minute since my last video, but we've been busy getting all the early bird pledges for the Jolly Lark painting handle Kickstarter shipped out. That's been a big success, and now we're ready to jump back into bringing more YouTube videos to the Jolly Lark channel. Today we are painting up one of the new Yennefer miniatures from Monster Fight Club. Thanks to my friends there for sending this to me. It was fun to paint, lots of detail, and we'll just jump right into it. Now, you might be thinking, first off, like, wait, Yennefer wears all black. Why is this miniature primed white? So my take on black is that it's sometimes easier, depending on the miniature, to get a clean, good-looking miniature, even if they're wearing all black, or mostly black, by starting with a white undercoat. And I'll tell you why. When you're ending up with a miniature that's wearing all black, you really want the areas that are not black, the skin, the sleeves, what have you, to really pop out from the black areas. And particularly with the advent of the new contrast colors, it's a lot easier to darken a light area than it is to lighten a dark area. So if we were starting from an all black primer, it really would be challenging to get the kind of spell effects that are coming out from her hands and her skin and her white sleeves to be as vibrant as they will be when working with a white undercoat. So that's a lot of introduction, and as I've been talking here, I've been putting on some Riekland Fleshshade, which is one of the Citadel contrast colors all over the skin area. So a little bit of the Riekland Fleshshade on all the skin areas, and then we're ready to move on to putting down some of the blacks. Now, you may notice that there looks like there's a little bit of shading on the model already, and that's because this is double primed. I find the black primer goes on a little more evenly and nicely, so I hit this with a coat of black primer first, and then gave it a pretty generous all-over coat of white. So in some of the cracks and crevices are still a little darker than just using white primer, and that's just fine, because those cracks and crevices we want to be a little bit darker anyway. Now, for the black, we're using one of what I think is maybe the most, or one of the most exciting new colors in the second wave of the Citadel contrast paints, and that's Ratling Grime. It's a grayish black that provides a real stark difference between the raised areas of the miniature and the recesses of the miniature, and I think it's the best one-coat black that I've ever used. Even though it's trying to be a dark gray, it has the effect of looking like a black, like a faded black when it goes on. The other black contrast, which I think is called Black Templar, it's very, very dark, and it's okay if you're trying to do a truly deep velvety black. But for most surfaces, I want more difference in between the highlights and the shadows, the lightest areas and the darkest areas of the miniature, and the Ratling Grime really does a good job of that. For a miniature that has multiple areas of different black materials, in this case, her clothing and her hair are both black, and she has black leather shoes and black cloth fabric, it is sometimes challenging to not have the miniature be kind of boring, because if you paint all the different black materials in this exact same color of black, you're going to end up with a miniature whose hair is exactly the same color as her shirt, and which is exactly the same color as her black leather boots, which isn't really how blacks work. So this is just a base coat, and then once all the areas that we want to be some sort of black are colored in with the Ratling Grime, we'll then go in with some different tints and just vary the different blacks up a little bit so the final miniature has more variation in what the different blacks actually look like. Once you've got the Ratling Grime blocked in over all the black areas, while that's drying, I'm going to go in with maybe my second new favorite GW color, and that's Tyran Blue. This is one of their shade colors, not a contrast, so it flows even more into the cracks and crevices. And boy, I really like this color for shading just about everything. I think this kind of mid bright blue shade provides a really nice shadow for flesh, for whites, a little bit in the comic booky, painterly kind of cartoony shade color for white. But I really like it. Shadows are blue and it looks great as a shade color for lots of things. So I'm going to shade her white sleeves with it. I'm going to drop a little bit onto the side of her face and into her eye sockets just to shade a little bit of the white primer and the kind of unlit side of her face. On other miniatures, I've successfully used this color to shade greens, blues, purples, reds. It's really a very versatile color. So just putting a little bit kind of under her neck, kind of under her jawline will help provide a little more definition for her face. Now, once all the Ratling grime is dry and the black areas are totally dry, we can start adding some tints to change the colors of the black. For the hair, we're going to use the Citadel shade Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a very dark kind of navy black blue. And we're going to put a nice generous layer of that all over her hair to give her sort of that raven black shiny hair. This is another really versatile paint that's great to have in your collection because it can be used to shade a wide variety of colors. Again, because natural shadows, sunlit shadows are kind of a bluish tinge, this works great over a variety of colors and is a little bit more realistic shade color than the Tyran blue we used before, if you prefer kind of a little darker, grittier look to your shadows. Up next is another great color. This is another one of Citadel's new contrast colors that was released in their second wave. This is a very, very kind of neutral brown. It goes on very dark. This is a very strong contrast color, and we're just using it to kind of tint the blacks a little bit. So I am going to mix it with a little bit of water on my palette. You don't want to get it too dark or you'll lose all the shading you've already got on there. I'm going to use this just to tint some of the leather straps on her outfit with a little bit of brown. Black leathers, especially, fantasy settings, non-industrially dyed leathers, they're all going to have a little bit of a brown undertone. So just putting a little bit of brown tint on all the leather aspects of her outfit will break up all the wide areas of black a little bit and just give it a little variation. Next up, we're going to give all of the fabric areas on the Yennefer miniature a light wash glaze of the Citadel shade DRUCHII Violet, which is kind of a dark purple. Again, there's no right or wrong here. I'm mostly just trying to differentiate the different areas of black from each other so the miniature looks interesting while still having the overall impression of being black on black on black. If you have a different collection of washes and tints or glazes in your paint collection, that's totally fine. I would recommend tending to use things that are on the transparent side. Watering down or diluting opaque paints to be a glaze may not work quite as well for tinting the black because it may color the shadows a little bit more than you'd like to. Now, right now, once everything's dried, I'm reasonably happy with how the miniature is looking. The different blacks look different from each other. We still got the spell effects to paint, but the black and black and black looks pretty good. So if you wanted to, if you're happy with how the outfit and the hair and all looks, you could skip this step and move on to painting the ribbon of magic around her hands and the base. But let me show you what I'm going to do to add a little bit of highlights all over the miniature. If you've watched my videos before, you may have seen this idea, is to take some transparent white. If you're using artist paints, like a zinc white works well for this because it's much more translucent than like a titanium white. But in this case, I've found that the Pro-Acryl transparent white works great straight out of the bottle and goes on easily. Now, with traditional approach to highlighting, what you would do is try to very, very carefully place the highlight color just on the raised parts of any one area of the miniature. So if you're trying to highlight a cloak, you'd only put the highlight lighter colors on the raised parts of the folds of the cloak, for example. But in this case, I'm using it a little differently, and I'm kind of going to paint it over whole areas, cracks and crevices, but I'm only going to put it on the areas that are kind of the upwards facing areas of the miniature. And my goal here is not necessarily just to lighten the traditional areas that you'd put highlight colors on, the raised areas, but to actually lighten the entire area, both the cracks and the crevices. But I just want to lighten those areas that are kind of upwards facing. And you can kind of see as I'm putting some of this transparent white on the miniature, it does still preserve some of the color that's underneath. And I'm only brushing it onto the areas that the areas you can see when looking at the miniature from above, like so. So tops of the hands, tops of the sleeves. And I'm very specifically not trying to highlight only the raised portions of the miniature, but to lighten the entire upwards facing area. I'm trying to put an even thin coat of the transparent white in both the cracks and the crevices, which is a little different than how you normally would highlight a miniature. But I think it works well for a miniature like this, especially where you've got a lot of areas that are similar but different colors nearby each other. It's much faster to use the transparent white all over everything than it is to highlight each individual area. This also works well in miniatures that use a lot of different colors that are nearby each other. And you can see another version of this highlighting scheme or highlighting technique in the dandelion video I posted earlier. I'll link to that below. So time jumping a little bit, I skipped a few minutes of working with the transparent white, and you can kind of see where I'm going here. The transparent white is very transparent, such that you're really not adding a lot of white with any one brush stroke, and it dries pretty quickly. So I'm just kind of turning the miniature, spinning it around on the painting handle, kind of gradually adding a little bit more and a little bit more white to areas as I want them to be a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter. Kind of imagine shining a super bright spotlight down on the miniature and just trying to lighten up the areas that are going to be facing that spotlight that's shining down from above. So you can see the top of her head has gotten very light. The top of her sleeves has gotten very light. I've added some white highlights to the hair. That's kind of bits of hair that are facing upwards. And the other parts of the miniature progressively have gotten fewer layers of white on them, because each layer of this transparent white it's pretty transparent. You're not going to change the color a lot by one layer of this stuff. I'm going pretty contrasty with the white, getting the very uppermost areas pretty bright, because my plan is for the next step to do another wash, do another layer of the gray to deepen everything back down again. So you can see from above there, it's really pretty bright, and you've ended up with something that's a little washed out, but we're going to go over it and add back in a little bit more of the color. We're going to do that by mixing some of the contrast medium. Airbrush medium also works well for this if you have some of that lying around. I don't like to use just water, because water tends to have too much surface tension and doesn't sit quite as well. So mix in some medium, could be contrast medium, could be airbrush medium, into the same Ratling Grime kind of gray that we're using before to get a lighter version of that gray that's not going to tint the miniature quite so much. And we're going to put this all back over the black areas of the miniature. This is going to make the shadows even a little darker. And because we've mixed some of the medium with it, and it's not quite as dramatic a tint on the raised areas, those areas of white highlights that we added previously aren't going to be as dark as the lighter areas were before. And this is a second time, just like the first. We're just going to take this mixture of diluted Ratling Grime contrast paint and put it all over the black areas of the miniature to pull it all back together again. While that dries, I'm just going to give the spell effects, the kind of magic effects swirling around her, a little bit more of some bright titanium white, just to brighten them up a little bit and prep those for a layer of contrast paint that's going to go on them next. The white primer over black just wasn't quite as bright white as I wanted. So just hit those spell effects with the bright titanium white will be a good base coat for some bright contrast colors in a minute. While you've got the bright white on your palette, you can also zoom in here to show you can add just some teeny tiny bright white highlights to her hair and the fur along her neck. And it'll just make those areas pop just a little bit more. Next up, we're going to give the miniature the absolute lightest possible hint of a dry brush we possibly can give. Really, I'm using a fat dry brush so it doesn't get into the cracks and corners. I'm wiping 99.9% of the paint off on a paper towel. You can see that it's hardly even tinting my thumb there. Super, super light. I'm just going to do this over the front of her body to catch some of the very edges of her boots, the straps, and just provide the little tiniest hint of a final highlight all over the blacks of her outfit, her clothes, and her boots. With that done, I'm going to grab the Riekland Fleshshade again and just add a little bit more shading to some of the shadowed areas of her face and her neck, just to darken up those shadows just a tick. This Yennefer miniature has a few little small details you might want to pick out in not black. I chose a coppery color for the buttons on her jacket. You could also grab a little bit of silver, or you could use the same copper color. There's a small belt buckle on the belt at her waist, and just use a nice sharp brush to pick that out. She also has a little bit of a locket on her neck. They're tiny enough that just a little highlight of a metallic is going to be enough for it. In this case, I used 2 Vallejo metal colors that I like. They're brass and they're steel, and those work well, but really any metallic colors will be just fine to pick out some little straps and buckles and stuff. And I'm not going to shade or highlight those because they're a real metallic paint. They'll do a fine job at that tiny little amount. They kind of highlight themselves. You'll be fine to leave those alone as is. Now, apologies, this next step slid a little bit off camera, but basically all I'm doing here is putting a nice, fat, thick coat of GW's Contrast AETHERMATIC blue all over the kind of ribbon of magic that's swirling around her. Nothing fancy, just a fat brush and lots of it, and just gonna put that AETHERMATIC blue all over that ribbon of magic. And then I'm gonna go in with the same AETHERMATIC blue and paint a very thin layer of it on some of the parts of her body that are facing the magic. Just kind of get a little bit of the glow from the magic on her outfit. So the side of her body, her left and her right kind of sides of her body that are facing the magic, a little bit of her hair that's near that magic swirl. Just add a little bit of that AETHERMATIC blue glow to those parts of her body is a nice effect. Vallejo's Verdigris color, which is that light bright blue you can see next to the pot of AETHERMATIC blue, also works well if you want to just put a little bit brighter highlight on any of the edges. I've got some of that down on the palette there. I'm also going to use that for her eyes. So for the eyes, I always start with as thin as brush as I can find and paint the whole eye socket black. That'll provide a little bit of a black line around the eyes and will create the pupil. And then get the color that you want to use for the whites of the eyes. In this case, I'm not actually using white, but I'm using that Vallejo Verdigris, which is a very, very light blue. Just grab my pointiest brush and put 2 teeny tiny dots in her eye sockets to create the effect of white dot, black dot, white dot, which at this scale is really all you need eyes to be. This takes a little practice. I don't always get it right on my first try, and if you don't like it, you can always paint it black and try again. To finish things off, I'm going to use a light black wash, in this case the new version of the Nuln oil, which is in the smaller bottle on the left there. It's an 18 milliliter bottle if you look at the bottle. The new formulation of the Citadel shades are much runnier and don't stain the raised surfaces as much, so that they really flow into the cracks a little bit better. I really like the new Nuln oil for just kind of outlining areas. I'm just going to put a little, it seems to also not have much of that kind of water stain look on the edges of where you're putting it. So I'm just going to put a little bit of the new Nuln oil in the darkest spots, where her legs are touching each other, kind of all the way from waist to ankle, kind of underneath her knees, in kind of under her arms, and just to darken up the shadows a little bit in those areas. And you can use this wherever you want to just define the colors of the miniature a little bit more. Kind of on her back, kind of things that also places you don't want the eye to focus on, and kind of darkening those areas naturally pulls focus away a little bit. And then to pull together all the highlights on her hair, especially those bright white kind of shining highlights we put on earlier, I'm just going to run this new formulation of Nuln oil all over her hair. Paint the base whatever color you want to match the tables you're playing on. This is the Pro-Acryl Dark Umber, which is a base color I like a lot. You can put some flock or turf on it on top if you want. Again, kind of match the playing surface or how you're playing. If you're playing on a role-playing grid, just a plain base may suit your purposes. The Monster Fight Club bases have a little bit of texture on top. You could dry brush the texture that's there, like I said, or add your own. The Nuln oil I'm using here also just to pick apart the different areas of color, putting a tiny bit of the Nuln oil like in between the skin color of her hands and the white of her sleeves, that sort of thing. And kind of do this as much or as little as you like. And once you think it looks good, call it done. Thanks for joining us for this Witcher painting series. We've now painted up Geralt, Dandelion, and Yennefer. Like, subscribe, comment if you have any questions. All that stuff helps grow the channel and bring you more videos. Let me know if you have any questions about the painting process here. Always happy to help in the comments. And we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.